Well, it is so great to be here. I have to laugh when Dr. Hillman and I were talking about doing this presentation in September, and I thought, December, it could be. Well, the weather it's like this would have been a rough night to be out driving around. So here we are, and it's wonderful to be with you tonight. So remotely works just as well for me, and we'll be able to answer a lot of questions when I'm done with the initial presentation. All right, so this will take about 25, 30 minutes max, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So here we go. So believe it or not, we have nearly 30 years worth of data to help us understand the issues having to do with adolescent sleep. More than 2,000 articles have been written about adolescent sleep, late start times, the health and safety of teens, and the psychosocial issues that go along with it. Clearly, the outcomes for the stakeholders in this change are the students, of course, teachers, parents, school administration, and community. So it's a lot of people that we have to think about in terms of what their stake is in this decision. I'm going to begin with some basic facts about sleep because this is the foundation for every decision that you're going to make. You need to know, and your community needs to know about the facts about sleep. Some of these things are going to be surprising, some things you probably already know. So why do we need sleep? There are essential processes that happen with sleep every night. For instance, every night your brain gets washed by your cerebral spinal fluid. So during the day, you will have moments, your brain records, it's like a recording machine. It records everything that happens during the day, everything you see, hear, whatever. But a lot of the stuff is just junk. It's like trash in your brain. If you heard a fire engine during a meeting today, your brain has recorded that. But tonight when you sleep, that fire engine noise is going to be totally irrelevant. There's no place to stick it in terms of a file for learning. So your brain will wash that away. And there are millions of bits of information that get washed every night by your cerebral spinal fluid. So the clearance of neurotoxins, and I'll explain more as we get into that, how that functions and where that happens, but it's exceedingly important. Clearly also in the brain, there are nerve cells that are repaired and connected. You have synapses, dendrites, and so on that get repaired during sleep because they get broken during the day, actually. And then, of course, learning, memory, and abstraction are enabled, all happening during sleep. Your brain is probably more active during sleep time than when you are awake. So the brain is an amazing, amazing organ, and we don't know much about it as we are exploring more. We don't realize how much we don't know. And this is something that when I present to students, I think they just are shocked. You will die sooner from a lack of sleep than you will die from a lack of food. That's how important sleep is. And that's why it's part of the Geneva Convention having to do with torture, that you cannot torture a prisoner with lack of sleep. It's considered a death sentence to deprive them of sleep. So how does this all begin? So many years ago, probably in the 1990s early, Mary Carskadden at Brown University was collecting saliva secretion during adolescent sleeps because they were trying to understand the adolescent brain. And this is the graph that shows the onset and offset of melatonin secretion during sleep. And you can see it jumps very sharply, probably around 10:15, 10:30, peaks around 2:45, 3 in the morning, up and down, and there's a sharp offset around 8 in the morning, 8:15. And this is really critical because this information is proof that the melatonin secretion that's prompted by the adrenal glands is how we understand what happens when we sleep, when we look at the physiological manifestation of this. So what do we know? We know that 42% of middle school students average less than 8 hours of sleep a night, and only 23% of high school students in the U.S., this is a U.S. statistic, obtain the recommended hours of between 8 and 9 hours of sleep per night. So you can see even the sleep requirement, when you look at the age of about 12, it's triggered by puberty. It's all related to when kids enter puberty, all of a sudden they have this sleep phase shift. And their sleep requirement actually goes up a little bit between 8.8, 8.7 to closer to 9.0. But the average amount of sleep, you can see precipitously drops between ages of say 12, 13 and down to 17, 18. This is part of the problem. So we look at the human sleep cycle. This is kind of a complicated diagram, but it basically shows the time from midnight to 7 in the morning. You're awake, and the first on the left side, you can see that is slow wave sleep. It's considered your most restorative sleep. That's the sleep on the left side. The left two deepest valleys are when your body does repair for the brain, and it also does things such as your immune system. Your immune system gets regenerated during those slow wave, deep sleep cycles. On the other hand, on the far right end, where the oval circle is, that is where most of your REM sleep occurs. And we'll get into what REM sleep is. It's rapid eye movement sleep. But REM sleep is lost when kids are getting up at 6:30 in the morning for buses. REM sleep is where all of the memory consolidation happens. This is an important point, because when you're getting kids up in the morning, their brain is still in a sleep mode. The brain still wants to be processing all of the information from the previous day, and that happens during REM sleep. So this is just sort of a summary of sleep memory and cognition. After learning, it enables the brain to consolidate new information, improves next day recall. Your brain has sort of like has an organizational system with file folders. It's like scaffolding. For those of you that are teachers and know about scaffolding, it scaffolds on previous information. So if you have something learned new, it puts it into the file folder, if you will, so that is part of the compendium of information you have. And next day, it's more able to be recalled when you have adequate sleep. One night of sleep deprivation, it will impair the brain function, and it imposes the deficit of ability to commit things to memory. And that's what I mentioned earlier about REM sleep. It has multifaceted functions in brain development, learning, and memory consolidation. In a study that I was involved in several years ago, this is a 5-year study that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in Denver, Colorado, involving 55,000 students. And the school district made major changes. This was Cherry Creek, Colorado district. So what we found with the students that reported their sleep time, so with the change, you can see at the top, middle school, high school was 1+ hour later. The elementary schools were 1 hour earlier. We'll get into that, but that was sort of controversial at the time that the decision was made. However, when you look at these graphs, you can see that the elementary students on the left, that's green, even though they started an hour earlier, they only lost 11 minutes of sleep a night. Middle school gained 29 minutes. High schoolers gained 45 minutes of sleep per night. On the right-hand side, the percent change, it was a non-significant decrease for elementary kids, significant increase for both middle school and high school. All right, so we know that the brain processes things academically during the night. This is from the very first study that I did in 1996 to 98 with, it probably was 23 or 25 area metro school districts. Edina at that time was the only district that had made the change, and they went from 720 to 840. Well, this was what happened after the years of the change. You can see on the left side, the districts that had the earliest start times earlier than 7:30 and so on for 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. But when the school like Edina had a greater than 8:30 a.m. Starting time, the grades jumped up significantly. So that was our first indication that we were looking at a real remarkable difference in academic performance. People often ask me about achievement tests and what do we know? There's grade inflation at school districts, and we know that grades can be very it's unpredictable from one district to another, and how even one classroom to another, frankly. Your math teachers may have grade on a sliding fee scale, a sliding percentage scale. Others don't have a sliding scale, they just have a percentage amount. So those things are really tricky in terms of assessing whether or not the achievement changes. So we look at the national ACT and SAT scores. And what we know from the national ACT exam, there is no evidence that the variation in start times affected the scores for high school students. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but it does say that there's no evidence. This is from 2020, that on the ACT exam. However, you look at individual state level scores on math and reading achievement, and that's where you start to see the difference. Probably has something to do with the test construction as well. Some of the questions they have to be nationally normed and so on. But you look at the state level math and reading scores, 1 hour later start leads to a 3 percentile point gain for the average middle school student. Math scores, it's interesting, math scores are more amenable and receptive to having more sleep. We don't know why. That's another thing that the brain researchers need to figure out. Why is math so sensitive to your amount of sleep versus other reading and other kinds of academic skills? Excuse me, but they have this impact that's really considerable for late start and math. And finally, lower performing students benefit more than others with a 1 hour delay. This is what we found for the students who are doing their state level achievement tests. In the study that I was given a grant from the CDC in 2010, then that was a national study that looked at school districts, selected school districts across the country. And this is what we learned from the districts that made the change. So those few districts that started their school between 8 and 8:35, there were statistically significant increases in one or more of the core classes in the high school, from English, math, social studies, and science, in 5 high schools. The start time at 8:55, there were statistically significant increases in the achievement of students in all first period core courses for all semesters at all grade levels in grades 9 through 12 in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They were by far, they started at 8:55. They were by far the latest starting school district, and they had by far the biggest changes. So we also know that the start time before 8 o'clock, it was significantly lower in the first period classes than in other periods. And that, of course, has to do with the brain still. If your class is starting at 7:55 or even 7:30, your brain is still asleep. And so the students are sleeping at their desk, or they're just not processing the new information. So again, this negative effect was particularly significant for math classes. So what do we know then about student engagement as measured by attendance at class, tardies, graduation rates, and so on? We did find, and the other studies have found too, that there's significant improvement in attendance and graduation rates for students in schools who have a delayed start time of 8:30 or later. 8:30 seems to be the key marker for when you can expect or anticipate improvement in attendance, graduation rates, and so on. This is related to the study that I did in Minneapolis. I did a 5-year study from 1998 to 2002. And Minneapolis couldn't be more different or diverse than from Edina when I first studied Edina. It's interesting, the student surveys that were completed, honestly, you could not tell the difference between a high school student in Edina versus that in Minneapolis when we looked at issues having to do with sleepiness, when they go to bed, when they feel sleepy, and when they wake up. But where we noticed really differences in the population that was more multiracial, multi-ethnic. So there were significant benefits for all of these subgroups, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Black, and White, for students in grades 9 to 11 after the start time change to 8:40 in Minneapolis. And part of the issue was the students who were, two things happening actually. Two things. One was the students who were mobile, who were homeless or moved from school to school to school. When the school started at 8:40, the kids somehow were able to stay in their previous high school. So, and it had something to do with the transportation available and the fact that they were able to get up and get on a bus and attend the school, even though their parents might have changed apartments and moved into a different attendance boundary area, they still actually were able to stay in the same school. And staying in the same school allows for attendance to improve and graduation rates to improve as well. So that was an interesting finding just about multi-ethnic students. Also, economically disadvantaged students have a great benefit. The magnitude of positive effects for later start is larger for economically disadvantaged students in the areas of higher course grades, higher achievement test scores, reduced tardies, improved attendance, and reduced suspensions. Lots of studies. You can see those are all that have been done across the United States. All have confirmed that this really assists any student that has any economic disadvantage in their life. So what about teachers? They're a key part of this whole stakeholder assessment. So when we assessed over 5,000 teachers, 5,200 and some, 52% of the secondary teachers saw fewer students falling asleep in class after the later start. The later start also allowed secondary teachers time for better planning across subject areas. So the teachers were still getting to school early. Secondary teachers tend to like early rising. Maybe that's part of their DNA of why they chose to be a secondary educator. But at any rate, they had more time for planning and for the teams to be meeting across subject areas. It's interesting, among those 5,200 some teachers, fewer than 1 in 5 indicated that high school and middle school students were ready for learning before 8 a.m. This is the collective knowledge. You have teachers who've been in the business for 15, 20, 30 years. They've seen it all. And, when they say, yeah, less than 20% of any of the teachers indicated that learning was good before 8 a.m. because they saw so many students sleeping at their desk. Both elementary and secondary teachers noted the schedule changes affected their personal lives. Certainly they have families, kids go to daycare, other things that had to do with car sharing with their spouse, but most say that the benefits to the students were worth it and they made adjustments accordingly. For elementary students, this is what we found in every case when we've looked at elementary, the shift looked at the tiered busing and if the shift was made for elementary kids to start earlier. There was increase in student attentiveness during class time. There was an increase in the students eating breakfast. The schools were able to structure their core classes, that'd be like reading, math, and so on, before lunch. And elementary teachers will all tell you that kids are best before lunch that's their best learning time. I'm a former elementary teacher and an elementary principal, and I can tell you that the mornings are when the kids really buckle down. That's when they really learn a lot. And after lunch, you get kids who are tired, who didn't sleep well, who, for whatever reason, are not able to pay attention as well. The afternoons are tougher. There's a decreased need for morning childcare. It allowed for fewer transitions for the students. You think about if a parent has to drop off a child for daycare at 6 or 7 in the morning, because they have to be to work at 7:30. These are kids that sit in a daycare setting or a home daycare, and maybe they're watching TV, maybe they're playing, maybe they're whatever they're doing. But most kids before puberty wake up early. That's what kids do. And so having a decreased need for childcare in the morning actually allowed the kids then to have fewer transitions. They didn't have to get on a bus, dropped off. They get dropped off at school, which I think made a big difference for a lot of children. There was no negative effect on academic achievement, not that we could find. And the research showed that after the first year, the majority of elementary families and their school staff preferred the earlier start. That's not to say there wasn't some complaints and grumbling about being there so early, but it didn't show that there was any problems with the students learning, and the teachers then adapted just fine. So this is what we know about academics. The later start time in secondary schools, it's equivalent to one being in a class with a third fewer students. Interesting. Then their instructional peers, teacher peers, on a teacher performance evaluation. Rise to the game of teaching, and their instructional performance is measured to be better when the teachers have themselves more sleep, and also are more ready for the learning experience. The latest effect of the starting time is similar to the size, as noted earlier, of reducing the class size from 22 students when we do class size reduction to 15 students in grades K through 3. It's equivalent for the amount of effect. And we know also finally that deficient sleep and academic performance are clearly related. As sleep increases for most students, academic outcomes do improve. This is really important. It's health and well-being stuff. We can talk academics all we want, but if the kids aren't healthy, and if other health issues intervene, it becomes more serious for their learning. So when we have students having less than 8 hours of sleep, and in fact, I'd like to just sort of point out when you do the math, okay, so high school students, any student that's secondary age student who's in this sleep phase shift, they basically can't fall asleep much before 11 p.m. 10:45 to 11:15 is the window. Let's just say 11 o'clock. If they sleep and they need sleep of 8 hours, that means that they really should not be awakened before 7 in the morning. Well, think about when kids are on a bus schedule, they have to get up. If they have even, unfortunately, before school activities like hockey practice or something else that gets them up early. But if they're getting less than 8 hours of sleep because they're getting up before 7 in the morning, you have increased rates of depression, anxiety, and fatigue, increased risk of suicide, increased rate of auto accidents, decreased athletic and motor skills, weight gain, elevated blood pressure, the likelihood of risk-taking drugs, behavior such as that has to do with I'm just blanking on the self-efficiency, the sort of executive function is the and compromised. And it interferes, of course, with the brain development of memory information. So this is done by the CDC. This youth risk YRBS is done every couple of years. And this was done actually some time ago, but it still is true today. So you can see, look at the difference between less than 8 hours of sleep versus more than 8 hours of sleep. And it has to do with cigarette use, alcohol use, marijuana use, sexual activity, feeling sad and hopeless, felt daily in the past 2 weeks, and they stopped their usual activities. It's just remarkable. It's a tipping point. 8 hours seems to be the tipping point for physical and mental health. This is a gripping graphic. And this is 27,000 students in Fairfax County schools were assessed. And this is what they said about their sleep. So on the left-hand side, you can see the students that reported 4 hours or less. We have 51, almost 52% of those students saying they feel sad and hopeless, and so on. Then you go to 5 hours, 6 hours, and 7. 8 hours is where we have the least amount of issues with hopelessness, suicide, suicidality, and so on. And when it gets to 10 or more hours, sometimes that is sort of an issue with the student's health that is not related to starting time. It has to do with or some other issues in their life, serious depression, that's clinical depression, needing to be treated by a doctor. So when you see 10 hours or more in an uptick, that is not the actual teenager needs between 8 and 9 hours of sleep. Okay, car crash. Car crashes are the #1 cause of death in teenagers. And the later start times in the study we did for the CDC, we saw a 13% reduction in teen car crashes. So when we look at the districts that were involved, and this is important, I think, for you in Northfield, because Mahtomedi is a small district, it's contained, and as is Jackson Hole, Wyoming, believe it or not. Their catchment area for their attendance is restricted because it's got mountains on all sides, and so you have students that basically aren't driving long distances at night after a date night or an athletic event. But South Washington County is enormous in terms of miles of area. And so students who are driving, who might, like I said, have an athletic event, dates, whatever, after 9 p.m., there was a 6% reduction. Wasn't as great only because they're driving on the road and they're and it's a longer distance. There's just longer distances that they had to drive home in South Washington County. All right, so now we get to phones and apps and technology. And it's very interesting for you to note that when I did the first studies in 1996, cell phones did not exist. And so this teen sleep surveys that I mentioned earlier that we couldn't tell any Edina student from a Minneapolis student was absolutely true, because these kids felt sleepy about 10:45 or 11, and they went to bed because there was nothing that kept them awake, other than maybe completing their homework, but they weren't even using computers much at that time. So here we are, almost 30 years later, and knowing that using technology within an hour of going to bed disrupts your sleep onset due to your brains being stimulated. That's part of the problem. 72% of adolescents and young adults use a smartphone within 30 minutes before going to bed, and 38% sleep with the cell phone ringer on in their bedroom. It's a real problem, because kids then, once they start texting each other in the middle of the night, or whatever they're doing, gaming is a really stimulating activity for the brain. So if you have kids that are doing games even up past in high mode operation, and it's really tough for them, I think, to then have the brain down and be ready for sleep and sleep onset. In fact, the more engaging the technology application, requiring mental alertness, the likelihood there's going to be difficulty falling asleep and not having restorative sleep. Okay, so here we are looking at research translation into policy decisions. These are things that over the years, we have real issues that need to be challenges that need to be addressed. And then there's issues that, excuse me, were not substantiated in any of the findings in any of the research over the years. So the left side, the left column, these are real issues. They're real issues. Athletics, the schedules on last class missed. You need to think about, how does this work? So we've got kids on traveling teams and so on. They're missing the last class. Do you not make the change because 50 or 25 kids are on the traveling basketball team when your high school is, say, 1,000 kids or 1,500 kids? Do you make a decision not to make the change because you have some kids on a traveling athletic team? Probably not the best way to make the decision. But then what you need to do is figure out, okay, what can we do? Maybe these kids' schedules can allow a study hall at the end, or whatever, some other class that is not as rigorous as trigonometry, let's say, for instance. Okay, that's the do with athletics. The younger children in the morning darkness is an issue. There is a website that's called First Light or something like that. And it shows you during the year when there is dusk or dawn and when the first light appears. And that is really helpful because it lets you know how safe our kids. There's an assumption that everybody's in the dark at 7:50 in the morning. Well, not necessarily, depending on the time of year. So the other thing that districts, or especially Minneapolis, did is they had parents involved in a block community communication. So on Monday, we had parents watching the elementary kids at the corner, Mr. Smith. And on Tuesday, it might have been, Mrs. Jones. And on Wednesday, so what they had, each parent in their block area were kind of a monitor of the children's safety at the corner in the mornings. That was one solution. I mean, there are other solutions, but that was one that the community found for themselves. I mentioned earlier about childcare schedules. We need to figure out how that can work. If you have childcare in your school buildings, how does that happen to get people, whether you have kids being dropped off at school, whether they have breakfast, all those things are things that need to be looked at. Parents' work schedules. One of the things that I'm glad that Dr. Hillman mentioned, that you're not going to make the decision too quickly, because if parents can work with their employers and say, my child's school next year in 2 years is going to start earlier, I need to work out with you my arrival time for my work. Hopefully, for many parents, not all, that will be something a discussion that could take place. And then local traffic patterns. And this is unanticipated totally in Edina. When they made the change, the problem with where the buses turned into the high school, there was no semaphore, there was no lights. The police had to be there directing traffic. It was a big mess until they figured out the timing of the lights, adding a traffic light, and so on. So it's just you need to work with the community about traffic and so on when you make these changes in all the schools. On the right-hand side, these were worries that were not ever really substantiated as being real. There was concern, oh, I heard from the coaches, oh, we're going to have less kids playing the games. We're going to win fewer games. Actually, the reverse was true. When the kids had more sleep, they remembered the plays better. And so they were able to actually maintain good athletic participation and standings. So this was, the coaches really did a turnaround when I interviewed them a year later. They were convinced that this was okay. There was concern that after school activities would decline with the kids, the high school kids, not being dismissed until 3 o'clock. That didn't happen. The same number of kids participated in chess club and French club and all those other different choir and so on after school. It didn't decline the attendance at all. There doesn't necessarily have to mean a higher cost for transportation. Now, I know that's a concern for many districts, and it might be something that you are concerned about as well. Many districts, when they just did the actual flip of the tiered busing, they did it at no cost. That has been done. It depends on how you structure your transportation. And when I was a special ed director as well, you have to think about how kids, where they wheel and spoke, are you picking them up on a local corner? Do you have specialized transportation for them? All of that needs to be taken into account. And your transportation director is key to this discussion. Hopefully I don't have somebody who says, I don't want to think about rerouting all my buses. I'm not going to talk to you about it. So hopefully you'll have somebody that's more ready to make some of these decisions and give you the information you need. And then there's a concern that after school employment would be affected negatively, and it was not. I called many businesses that hired high school kids after school. Nobody wanted the students there until about 4 p.m. because that was when the rush, the people who were going home might stop at a convenience store, at a gas station, at the mall to pick up something, a grocery store or whatever. So most of those employers did not think that and did not see any reduction in their employment staff and availability of high school students to work after school. I mentioned earlier about the transportation criteria. It's really important, but you need to think about the student ride time. How long are they on the bus? The safety at the bus stops, after school activities, cost, efficiency, and you need to get the parent feedback. Parents need to have a say in this. But the one thing is, it's really important. It's never helpful to put on a survey, what do you think would be a problem for your child, unless the child maybe has a handicap. Because what parents think and assume is you need to ask questions about, how does this actually affect you? How did this affect you? Talk to other districts who got parent feedback. They're the ones that are going to help you. So this is just a quick summary about this start time having to do with class size. The RAND Corporation did a study, found that delayed start times they estimated $83 billion to the U.S. economy over the next decade. Pretty amazing. And one standard deviation rise in test scores for a student could increase their future earnings by 8% because they're perhaps graduating high school. Maybe they've dropped out before they could. And so the benefit's even larger for students at the bottom of the grade distribution. Finally, principals easier to live with. Parents need, as I said earlier, adequate time to adjust their schedules. The community needs to be involved. The final question is, how late is late enough? Districts making a modest move to a later start time experience only modest benefits. The benefits were there, but they experienced the same amount of community disruption as did the districts that made the change to start at 8:30. In other words, don't do this incrementally. Like, oh, 1 year we're going to do from 8 to 10, and the following year we're going to move to 8:30. That's really not a strategy, because parents find that the disruption, if they can deal with it once, that's all they need to deal with. But repeatedly makes them crazy and angry. Okay. And of course, I said earlier, the starting time of 8:30 shows the most positive. Students will benefit equally. You got, your high flyer students, they're gonna learn we're also going to really have the issues having to do with loss of sleep and the other car crashes and other negative things that happen. Of course, has to be to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of students. And anticipation is often worse than the reality. That's what we found. And the challenges were reduced over time. We need to, very important, you need to educate the general public about brain development during adolescence. It's people don't understand. They think this is for the convenience of the teenagers, and it is not. This is about teens' health, safety, and learning. We need to engage the community in solutions involving all the key stakeholders, the kids, the parents, and so on. Providing an adequate time for the families to become informed. Each community has different unique conditions. Absolutely. There's no one size that fits all. But talking with other school districts that might be similar to you in size or location or other demographic characteristics, you'll find that there's a lot of solutions that you might have not thought of before by talking to other people. So, what to do next? It's very important, as I said a minute ago, parents need to become better informed about the importance of sleep, especially this information about the risk behavior. And their kids are easier to live with, okay? Teens need to learn about sleep on their own body and how it affects them and their decision making and their ability to be flexible. When teenagers can be not so easy to manage, but this certainly makes a difference when they have adequate sleep. And then finally, teachers and administrators need to discuss how the sleep needs interact with school activities and actions. For instance, one of the things that the schools that I've been dealing with have done with teachers is don't have the turn-in time for a computer paper to submit it at midnight, because all that does is support the kids who procrastinate, and they'd started at 11 p.m. So teachers, by and large, in one school district just said turn-in time, the deadline always every night is 10 p.m. and nothing is accepted after that. That then cracking earlier so that they're not sitting at 11:35 at night. Let's hope. Okay. So finally, this is the last slide. We need to have remind phase shift in teens. It's based in human development. It's biology, pure and simple, and it's not due to rebellious adolescent behavior. When making decisions, it's important to keep the focus on the child and not on the system.